The Danube River has witnessed the march of empires for thousands of years. It has seen Roman legions, barbarian hordes, and the rise of kingdoms that have long since turned to dust. But in the late summer of 1396, the waters of this great European artery reflected something new, something that was supposed to be the crowning glory of Christendom. It reflected the gleaming armor of the most magnificent army the West had assembled in centuries. They were the flower of French chivalry, the heavy cavalry of Burgundy, the knights of Germany, and the warriors of Hungary. They numbered in the tens of thousands, a host so confident in their martial prowess that one of their leaders famously boasted that if the sky itself were to fall, they would uphold it on the points of their lances. They were wrong. By the time the sun set on the 25th of September, the sky had indeed fallen, but not by the hand of God. It was brought down by the disciplined steel of a rising power from the east. The river did not reflect glory that evening. It reflected fire, slaughter, and the desperate flailing of men drowning in their own heavy plate. This was the Battle of Nicopolis. It was the last great crusade of the Middle Ages, and it was not merely a defeat. It was a catastrophe that would ring through the halls of Europe for generations, a collision between the old world of feudal arrogance and the new world of professional, centralized warfare. It was the moment the door to Europe was kicked open, leaving the continent vulnerable to an Ottoman expansion that would last for centuries. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must look away from the battlefield and into the fractured soul of Europe in the late 14th century. The continent was not a unified entity, but a collection of squabbling kingdoms, torn apart by the 100 Years' War between England and France. The church itself was broken, with two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, claiming the keys to heaven, dividing the loyalty of kings and commoners alike. It was an age of plague, rebellion, and uncertainty. Amidst this chaos, the idea of a crusade offered a seductive solution. It was a chance to unify the quarreling factions of Christendom against a common enemy, a way for the nobility to wash away their sins in the blood of the infidel, and, perhaps most importantly, a distraction from the political failures at home. The call for aid came from King Sigismund of Hungary. His kingdom stood on the bleeding edge of the frontier. To the south, the Ottoman Empire, under the command of Sultan Bayezid I, was expanding with terrifying speed. Bayezid was known to his men as the Thunderbolt, a moniker earned for the speed with which he moved his armies across the rugged terrain of the Balkans and Anatolia. He had already reduced Bulgaria to a vassal state, and his shadow was lengthening over the Hungarian plains. Sigismund knew that Hungary alone could not withstand the Ottoman tide. He appealed to the courts of the West, painting a picture of a Christian bulwark about to collapse. The response was overwhelming, particularly from France and Burgundy. For the Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, this was a golden opportunity. He sought to project power and prestige, to show that the House of Burgundy was the true leader of the French nation. He appointed his son John, Count of Nevers, to lead the expedition. John was only 24 years old, eager for glory, and entirely inexperienced in the brutal realities of Eastern warfare. Around him gathered the crème de la crème of the nobility, the Admiral of France, the Marshal of France, and hundreds of counts and barons. They spent fortunes outfitting themselves. This was not just a military campaign, it was a parade. Their armor was etched with gold, their tents were made of silk, and they brought with them wagon trains filled with fine wines, silverware, and servants. They prepared for a war of pageantry, expecting to sweep aside the Ottoman rabble with a single majestic charge. The army that assembled in Buda in the summer of 1396 was a coalition of roughly 30,000 men, though medieval estimates often wildly inflated this number. While the core was the heavy French and Burgundian cavalry, there were also contingents from England, Italy, Poland, and Bohemia, alongside the main Hungarian host commanded by King Sigismund. From the very beginning, however, there were cracks in the foundation. The French knights, obsessed with the code of chivalry and their own personal honor, viewed their Hungarian allies with disdain. They considered the locals to be unrefined and their tactics cowardly. Sigismund, who understood the Ottomans better than anyone, advised caution. He knew that Bayezid was not a tribal chieftain, but a sophisticated strategist with a professional standing army. The French dismissed his warnings as the timid bleating of a lesser king. As the Crusaders marched south along the Danube, their discipline began to disintegrate. They were moving through friendly Christian territory in the Balkans, yet they treated the land as if it were conquered ground. They pillaged villages, stole livestock, and abused the local population. The unity of the cross was a thin veneer over the arrogance of the sword. They saw themselves as the arm of God, and therefore, whatever they took was theirs by right. This behavior alienated the very people they had come to save, but the commanders did little to stop it. They were too busy feasting and celebrating victories that had not yet been won. Their destination was Nicopolis, the city of victory, a strategic fortress sitting on a limestone cliff above the Danube. It was the key to controlling the lower Danube, and a vital link between the Ottoman territories and their enemies to the north. The Crusaders arrived in early September and laid siege to the city, but they were ill-equipped for a siege. They had brought no heavy siege engines, no trebuchets capable of smashing the thick walls. They relied on mining operations and starvation, assuming the garrison would surrender at the mere sight of their magnificent army. While the Crusaders sat before the walls of Nicopolis, drinking their wine and gambling in their silk tents, Sultan Bayezid was moving. He had been besieging Constantinople when news of the invasion reached him. True to his name, the Thunderbolt abandoned the siege of the Byzantine capital and marched his army north with breathtaking speed. He gathered his vassals along the way, including the heavy cavalry of his Serbian ally, Stefan Lazarevic. The Ottoman army was a mirror opposite of the Crusader host. Where the Crusaders were a loose collection of individual glory-seekers, the Ottomans were a unified machine. At their core were the Janissaries, elite infantry enslaved and trained from childhood to be perfectly loyal to the Sultan. They were disciplined, fanatical, and professional. The Crusaders had no idea Bayezid was coming. Their reconnaissance was practically non-existent. They mocked reports from scouts that the Sultan was near, accusing the scouts of trying to frighten the army to steal money. It was only when Ottoman foragers were spotted on the nearby hills that the reality of the situation began to dawn on the camp. Even then, the reaction was one of chaotic excitement rather than tactical preparation. Knights scrambled to put on their armor while half drunk, shouting for their horses. The feasting tables were overturned in a rush to battle. On the morning of September 25th, the two armies faced each other. The battlefield was a plain south of the fortress, bordered by woods and rising into sloping hills where the Ottoman main force was concealed. King Sigismund, desperate to impose some order, called a war council. He proposed a strategy that utilized the strengths of the coalition. He wanted the Hungarian and Wallachian light cavalry and infantry to form the vanguard. He explained that the Ottomans always started the battle by sending forward irregular skirmishers to break the enemy's formation. If the French heavy cavalry charged first, they would waste their energy and their horses on worthless peasant soldiers. Sigismund pleaded with the French to hold back, to wait until the main Ottoman force was revealed, and to deliver the killing blow when it mattered most. The reaction from the French command was one of outrage. To ask the finest knights in Europe to march behind peasants and Eastern auxiliaries was an insult to their honor. The Count of EU, the Constable of France, declared that to take up the rear would be a dishonor to the crown of France. He demanded the vanguard. The young Count of Nevers, eager to prove himself, sided with the hotheads. The voices of reason, including the seasoned Enguerrand de Coucy, were drowned out by accusations of cowardice. The unity of command shattered before the first arrow was loosed. The French would charge alone. The earth began to tremble as thousands of armored war horses accelerated into a gallop. It was a sight of terrifying beauty. The French knights clad in plate armor, lances lowered, banners streaming in the wind, smashed into the Ottoman front lines. As Sigismund had predicted, the front lines were made up of irregular infantry and skirmishers. They stood no chance against the heavy cavalry. The French tore through them like a scythe through wheat, scattering the lighter troops and trampling them into the dust. The knights, intoxicated by the ease of the slaughter, believed the battle was already won. They shouted victory and pressed forward, ignoring the fact that they were losing cohesion with every yard. They reached the foot of the hill where the Janissaries were waiting. Here, the terrain turned against them. The ground was broken and steep, and the Ottomans had planted rows of sharpened wooden stakes in the earth. The horses, exhausted from the initial charge and carrying the immense weight of armored riders, could not force their way through the barricades. The knights were forced to dismount. Now, the flower of French chivalry was on foot, trudging uphill in heavy steel under the blazing sun. Yet even on foot, they were formidable. Their armor was nearly impervious to the arrows of the Janissaries, and their skill with the sword was unmatched. They hacked their way through the stakes and engaged the Ottoman infantry in brutal hand-to-hand combat. They fought with the desperation of men who knew no other way. Slowly, agonizingly, they pushed the Janissaries back. They reached the plateau at the top of the hill, gasping for breath, sweat blinding them inside their helmets. They looked out across the field, expecting to see the fleeing backs of the Sultan's army. Instead, they saw the nightmare of every medieval commander. Waiting for them, fresh, mounted, and silent, were the Sipahs, the Ottoman heavy cavalry, and behind them sat Sultan Bayezid himself, watching the exhausted French knights with cold calculation. The Crusaders had fallen for the oldest trick in the book, the feigned retreat and the ambush. They were isolated, miles ahead of their Hungarian allies, tired and unhorsed. The Sipahs charged. The impact was devastating. The French, who had been the hunters moments ago, were now the prey. They were surrounded, their formation collapsing under the weight of the fresh Ottoman attack. The Lion of France was being torn apart by the wolves of the steppe. The Admiral of France, Jean de Vienne, the oldest and most experienced soldier among them, rallied a small group around the banner of the Virgin Mary. He fought until he was cut down, dying alongside the flower of his generation. The Count of Nevers, the leader of the expedition, was captured, spared only because of the richness of his armor, which promised a hefty ransom. Back on the plain, King Sigismund watched in horror. He saw the French charge disappear over the hill, and then he saw the riderless horses coming back. He knew the disaster had happened. Desperate to salvage the situation, he ordered the Hungarian army forward. The Hungarians and their allies fought bravely. They engaged the Ottoman infantry and began to push them back. For a brief moment it seemed that the battle might still be turned. The sheer numbers of the Christian coalition were beginning to tell, and the Ottoman lines wavered. But Bayezid had one last card to play. He had kept his most reliable vassal in reserve. Stefan Lazarevic, the despot of Serbia, a Christian fighting for the Ottoman Sultan, led his heavy cavalry onto the field. This was the decisive moment. Lazarevic did not hesitate. He led a charge that smashed into the flank of the Hungarian army. The intervention of the Serbians broke the Crusaders' will. The Wallachians, seeing the battle turning against them, withdrew from the field to save their own forces. The Hungarian line crumbled. Panic seized the army. It was no longer a battle, it was a rout. Men threw down their weapons and ran for the river. Sigismund, realizing all was lost, was persuaded by his bodyguards to flee. He boarded a boat on the Danube and escaped, leaving his army to its fate. The retreat was a massacre. Those who weren't cut down by the pursuing Ottoman cavalry were driven into the Danube, where thousands drowned, dragged under by their armor or the weight of clinging comrades. The river, as the chroniclers later wrote, ran red with blood for miles. The fighting ended, but the horror did not. The next day, Sultan Bayezid toured the battlefield. He was enraged by the heavy losses his own army had sustained, particularly among his infantry. He ordered the prisoners to be brought before him. There were thousands of them, French Burgundian, German Hungarian. Bayezid separated the highest-ranking nobles, including the Count of Nevers, who would be ransomed for vast sums of gold. For the rest, there would be no mercy. What followed was one of the darkest episodes in the history of medieval warfare. The Sultan ordered the prisoners to be executed. From early morning until late afternoon, the captives were brought out in groups. They were beheaded, clubbed to death, or simply stabbed where they stood. The Count of Nevers and the other high-ranking nobles were forced to watch the slaughter of their men. They stood in silence as the executioners worked, the piles of bodies growing higher, the ground turning into a swamp of gore. It is said that Bayezid only stopped the killing when his own advisors begged him to cease, pointing out that so much blood would bring a curse upon him. By the time the sword was stayed, thousands of Christian soldiers lay dead. The news of the catastrophe at Nicopolis trickled back to Europe slowly. At first, no one believed it. The rumors were dismissed as lies spread by enemies of the state. It was not until the King of France received a letter from the Sultan himself, along with the first few survivors, who straggled back in rags, that the truth sank in. The shock was profound. The bells of Paris, which had been ready to ring for victory, remained silent. The court of Burgundy, which had spent so much to equip the expedition, was plunged into mourning. The ransom for the Count of Nevers and his companions would nearly bankrupt the duchy, requiring taxes that squeezed the peasantry for years. The defeat at Nicopolis was more than just a lost battle, it was a psychological turning point. It marked the end of the crusading ideal as a unifying force in European politics. The West realized that the Ottomans were not merely a nuisance on the periphery, but a superpower that could crush the best armies Europe could field. The defeat paralyzed Western intervention in the Balkans. It left the remnants of the Byzantine Empire, specifically Constantinople, completely isolated. The city would hold out for another half-century behind its massive walls, but its fate was effectively sealed at Nicopolis. There would be no more grand coalitions coming to its rescue. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, the road had been paved by the failures of 1396. Furthermore, the battle exposed the obsolescence of feudal warfare. The French knights, for all their bravery and expensive armor, had been defeated by superior tactics, discipline, and a unified chain of command. The individual heroics that were the stuff of Arthurian legend had proven useless against the machinery of the Ottoman state. It was a harsh lesson that Europe would take a long time to learn. The age of the mounted knight as the undisputed master of the battlefield was beginning to wane, though it would take the gunpowder revolution to finally end it. In the years that followed, King Sigismund would eventually become the Holy Roman Emperor, but the shadow of Nicopolis would hang over him for the rest of his life. He had seen the future on the banks of the Danube, and it was a future where Christendom was on the defensive. The Ottoman Empire continued its inexorable rise, pushing deeper into Europe, capturing Thessalonica, Serbia, and eventually laying siege to Vienna itself centuries later. The fear of the Turk became a permanent fixture in the European psyche, a bogeyman that would shape diplomacy and wars for the next 300 years. As we look back on the events of 1396, it is easy to blame the arrogance of the French or the disjointed leadership of the coalition. But Nicopolis was a clash of two different worlds, two different eras. The Crusaders rode into battle with the mindset of the 12th century, believing that zeal and lineage were enough to secure victory. They ran headlong into the 14th century's most modern military machine. The site of the battle is quiet now. The fortress of Nicopolis still stands in ruins, overlooking the wide, slow-moving Danube. The screams of the dying, the thunder of hooves, and the clash of steel have long since faded into the wind. But the legacy of that day remains. It is a reminder of the cost of hubris, the danger of underestimating one's enemy, and the fragility of alliances built on pride rather than purpose. 30,000 men marched south to save a civilization, but only a fraction returned. They left behind not just their lives, but the illusion of invincibility.